Outrage over the brutal murder of George Floyd in the hands of U.S. police officers continues to reverberate throughout the African continent, with protesters expressing outrage over the persecution of people of African descent in the U.S.
Black lives matter, and racial discrimination must stop in the interest of peace, unity, and progress.
Solidarity forever.
Solidarity forever.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Africa Today. I'm your host, Mubarak Kenya.
And hello from me, Sheila Nelima. In this edition, we are once again focusing on ongoing reactions by Africans following incidents of U.S. police brutality meted on African Americans.
In our program today, we are also highlighting on the African Development Bank, which recently caved in to U.S. pressure to open an independent evaluation of an inquiry into its president, Akinwumi Adesina.
And as usual, I am bringing you news from all over Africa. And of course, I will read your comments from social media.
So stay with us for the next 25 minutes.
U.S. racism angers Africa.
The people of Africa continue to condemn in the strongest possible terms the horrific murder of George Floyd, an unarmed African-American in the hands of white U.S. police officers.
Ironically, Floyd was murdered on Africa Day, marked globally every year on the 25th of May. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is also the African Union chairman, said Floyd's murder opened deep wounds.
The killing of George Floyd has opened up deep wounds for all of us. But these are the wounds that our brothers and sisters in the United States live with day in, day out, week in and week out, year in and year out. The struggles waged by you, Babu Mlangeni, and the fighters of your generation were foremost in the service of the people of South Africa. But they were also for the cause of liberation of all who suffer under tyranny and oppression. That is why we stand in solidarity with our African-American brothers and sisters.
Now, for more on this subject, we contacted Life Malcolm, an African rights activist, for his insight. Now, thanks a lot, Mr. Malcolm, for joining us. What is your take on the response of the African Union following the cruel murder of George Floyd?
It's an illustration of what African people here and around the world know. We are all one African nation. You know, a lot of people over the course of time have tried to divide African people into some kind of fake types of nations, like, like African Americans and Black Brits and other things like that, make up stuff. But we've come to understand here that we are one African people, one African nation, and what happens to one of us anywhere around the world happens to us everywhere around the world. And so now it's good that the rest of the world is seeing that type of unity on full display.
Last June, African nations called for the urgent convening of the United Nations Human Rights Council to urgently debate racism and police brutality, which aimed the unrest in the United States and beyond over George Floyd's death. The UN's top human rights body met in Geneva and was addressed by George Floyd's brother, Philonise Floyd, who urged the United Nations Human Rights Council to work for justice for Black people in the U.S.
You and the United Nations are your brothers and sisters keepers in America, and you have the power to help us get justice for my brother George Floyd. I'm asking you to help him. I'm asking you to help me. I'm asking you to help us, Black people in America.
Following intense pressure from Western countries, African nations backed away from their initial push for a commission of inquiry, the Council's most intrusive form of scrutiny, focusing more on human rights violations by the U.S.
Now, the final resolution, which was co-sponsored by Iran and Palestine, condemned the continuing racially discriminatory and violent practices by law enforcement officers against Africans and people of African descent, in particular, which led to the death of George Floyd.
Meanwhile, the Black Lives Matter movement has taken root in Africa, where many are joining global protests in response to the death of George Floyd.
Black lives matter, and racial discrimination must stop in the interest of peace, unity, and progress. If this does not stop, Africans, we must take our destinies into our hands and fight for our rights. Because according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we are all born free. We are all born equal. Nobody is more equal than the other. We all have our thoughts and our ideas, and we should be all treated the same way.
Now, anti-US protests have taken place in several African countries. What message do the protests in Africa send to Trump's administration?
Anti-US protests are anti-imperialist protests. So these demonstrations send the message to the Donald John Trump administration that we recognize the United States is the headquarters of imperialism. And until imperialism is dealt with, done away with, all of our attentions and our major energies will be focused on the headquarters of imperialism. And Donald John Trump's administration should be on notice, as should those administrations to follow. African people recognize that what happens to one of us anywhere happens to one of us everywhere, happens to all of us. And we know that the source of our oppression has been headquartered right here in the United States government. So it's good that African people all around the world is putting this administration on notice.
Amid protests over the killing of George Floyd, historical monuments in both the US and Europe continue to be targeted due to their links to the West's history of slavery and colonialism. In Africa, too, there is a renewed debate over these symbols of white domination, with many calling for their removal, while some claiming that they serve as a constant reminder of the ills of colonialists. In South Africa, activists assembled outside the country's parliament and called for the removal of the Louis Botha statue.
Not continue after 44 years of the 1976 revolution of young black people. We cannot continue to have colonial symbols that represent black oppression still be up in today's world in a free South Africa.
Symbols of colonialism have been pulled down in many parts of the US. Why are African countries not taking similar action?
Perhaps our brothers and sisters on the continent recognize better than we that pulling down these types of monuments, vestiges of colonialism, as some people refer to them, pulling those things down don't do anything for our material reality.
After Floyd's murder, masses have been rallying across the world in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement, with symbols of colonialism and slavery being pulled down.
Meanwhile, outside of Africa, protesters have defaced statues of colonialist leaders who were involved in slavery, in some cases leading to the removal of the monuments altogether. The Belgian port city of Antwerp took down a statue of King Leopold II, known for his brutal rule over what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Millions of Congolese died or were maimed working in rubber plantations and in military expeditions, while Leopold amassed a huge personal fortune.
Now, can the Black Lives Matter movement trigger a global awakening by oppressed masses against oppressive Western powers?
I'm not certain what the Black Lives Matter movement, as you put it, can do. What I am certain of, however, is that the Black Power movement is global. The Black Power movement is not only global, it is focused on the African workers. And so that's the difference between the Black Power movement and any other of these so-called movements that emerge.
While many in Africa have been protesting in solidarity with oppressed African Americans, Ghana has taken a practical step by rolling out a program to welcome back home mistreated African Americans. Ghana's Minister of Tourism, Barbara Otengiasi, spoke at a George Floyd's memorial in Accra, where she urged African Americans to consider Africa their home and leave America.
Racism must end. We pray and hope that George Floyd's death will not be in vain, but will bring an end to prejudice and racial discrimination across the world.
And now in this segment of our program, my colleague will be presenting you with news and events from across Africa. What do you have today, Sheila?
Thank you, Henia. Today we touch on a little bit of every part of the continent. Let's start with the South. The government of South Africa has set aside funds for the youth and youth-led organizations. The fund, called Driving Force for Change, aims to support innovative youth-led projects that tackle environmental issues. The government initiative is to enable the country reach its developmental goals and address the unemployment crisis. Now, Tanzania, Benin, and Mauritius were moved up the World Bank income rankings. Although the ranking does not include the impact of the pandemic on the countries, the announcement was a win for these African economies. Algeria and Mauritius were, however, moved to the lower categories. Now, in a sad state of events, 275 carcasses of elephants have been found in northern Botswana. The Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks confirmed. A report done by Elephants Without Borders stated in a publication on the mysterious deaths of this endangered species. Investigations are ongoing. Now, Angola's Ministry of Transport authorized the restart of 13 projects in the maritime, ports, and railway sectors. The projects have been on hold since the start of the pandemic, but are now gradually resuming. Construction is currently in progress. The Ethiopian Airlines group leader announced that the airline has registered some profit despite the pandemic. While the carrier had grounded its commercial flights, the cargo business is reported to have done very well. They also announced that the airline is waiting for compensation from Boeing NA after the fatal crashes. Now, the government of Namibia is rolling out an affordable housing project aimed at constructing 600 houses by 1 year. The project is to be done in informal settlements in the capital city. The government aims to target both low-income and middle-income earners. That's the end of this news part. Visit our social media pages for news updates. Don't go anywhere, we will be right back.
U.S. meddling in the African Development Bank.
The African Development Bank recently caved into U.S. pressure to open an independent evaluation of an inquiry into its president, Akinwumi Adesina.
The U.S., which is a shareholder at the bank, arrogantly rejected an internal investigation that cleared him of allegations of favoritism. The former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, will now head up a corruption probe into the leader of the African Development Bank.
African countries own 60% of the African Development Bank's shares, while non-African countries own 40%, out of which the U.S. owns only 6.6%.
The accusations facing Adesina are seen by many as part of a wider U.S. plot to pursue its nefarious interests in this top Pan-African bank. A leading Nigerian journalist and politician elaborated here on the U.S. plot to oust Adesina. Let's take a listen.
Now, what has happened with the American petition now will seem to be a confirmation of the earlier suspicion of the position of the group of indignant members of the AFDB that America has a hand in the conspiracy against Akinwumi Adesina.
The African Development Bank.
Adesina has issued a press statement in which he strongly criticized what he termed as unprecedented attempts to taint his reputation. Adesina said, "I maintain my innocence with regard to trumped-up allegations that unjustly seek to impugn my honor and integrity, as well as the reputation of the African Development Bank."
For an incisive analysis on this issue, we contacted Julius Mbaluto, an African affairs analyst. Now, our first question, Mr. Mbaluto, is there any truth in the corruption accusations facing Adesina?
Well, to establish the truthfulness of the allegations against Adesina, the Committee of Ethics based within Africa Development Bank held an inquiry, and this inquiry found Adesina innocent of the allegations that were leveled against him. Of course, having found him innocent, the USA has refuted and kind of disagreed with that kind of finding.
Thank you, Mr. Mbaluto. Stay tuned for more.
Sources say the United States of America dislikes the revolutionary manner Adesina has been driving the African development banks, as it would stop Africa from relying on the West for solution to the continent's problems. Adesina has also been passionate about agriculture. He believes that what Africa does with its agriculture will determine the food security of the world.
You know, I've always been saying it, that Africa's biggest asset, it's in agriculture. 65% of all the arable land to feed the 9 billion people in the world is not in Asia, it's not in Latin America, it's not in Europe, it's in Africa.
Why is the United States interfering in the affairs of the African Development Bank under the guise of fighting corruption?
If we were to talk about fight against corruption, maybe then USA may not be the right people to talk about that subject. The history of the US probably and the Western nations have been shaken by the presence of China, shaken by the presence of Africa Development Bank that tended to replace the Bretton Woods institutions.
Meanwhile, the Nigerian House of Representatives urged the Board of African Development Bank to halt further harassment of the bank's president, Akinwumi Adesina, who is also a Nigerian citizen. Speaking at a plenary session in June, senior lawmaker Ndudi Elumelu noted that African leaders stated in clear terms that no nation, no matter how powerful, had a veto power over the AFDB. He strongly rejected U.S.-led accusations against Adesina, saying they will destabilize the bank.
That if this sort of withholding and unnecessary harassment is not put to check and discouraged, it may become a recurring decimal, thereby destabilizing the stability the bank has enjoyed for decades and the intended results of the steady decrease.
Some have called the current U.S.-led onslaught on Adesina as imperialistic interference and neo-colonialism. Is this point of view correct?
USA is just one of the 27 members who are non-regional members who as shareholders of the African Development Bank. So therefore you ask yourself, when inquiry is conducted and is pleasing to, let's talk about all these other members, especially all the African members, and you're talking about they are okay with that. You ask yourself, USA is just one member. Why does USA think it should be having the upper hand of whatever happens?
Despite U.S. opposition, the Executive Council of the African Union has supported Dr. Adesina's candidacy for a second term as President of the African Development Bank. Now, here is Dr. Adesina's take on the endorsement.
It is a great honor to serve as President of African Development Bank. It's not a job as far as I'm concerned. It's a mission that I have. And I feel tremendously humbled that African Union Executive Council will endorse my candidacy as the only candidate. And that says a lot about not just me, but it says a lot also about the bank and what we've done and how the countries appreciate what we've done.
Do African countries have the power to stop the U.S. interference in the affairs of the African Development Bank, considering the fact that they are the majority shareholders?
Currently, probably not a united position when it comes to African leaders. There are those who may think, oh, we still want these big investors, we still want the input of technology or whatever. But yeah, Africa can stand on their feet. Africa can just say, we can do it on our own. They can fund their own organization. And that's a position I think should be really powerful. If Africa Development Bank can be funded fully by even African countries without reference to any other country, that would be the best thing for Africa. You know, we will see economic independence beginning to be achieved. Sovereignty of the continent, you know, that respect. Yeah, this is a continent with some 54 countries. Sovereign nation, not a single nation is a colony. They're all independent states. That's where we need to be as Africa.
The African Development Bank Group says its main objective is to spur sustainable economic development and social progress in Africa, and thus contributing to poverty reduction.
Africa is not a poor continent at all, but Africa just happens to have a lot of poor people. And so what we've got to do is, God has blessed this continent with a lot of natural resources. You know, we've got great sunshine, we've got great agricultural lands. In fact, 65% of all the available arable land to feed 9 billion people in the world by 2050, it's not in Asia, it's not in Latin America or Europe, it's actually in Africa. We've got lots of oil, we have gas, we have minerals, we have metals. So we don't have any excuse to be poor. What we've got to do is to manage those resources well, is to industrialize that. And that's why the bank has actually launched a major strategy called Industrialize Africa.
What has been the contribution of the African Development Bank to the continent's development?
The good thing with them is the African Development Bank tends to work within the continent. They fully understand the dynamics of the continent.
Amid U.S. interference in the management of the African Development Bank, Africans are now demanding breathing space and calling on non-regional neo-colonial powers to stop exerting undue pressure on the continent.
Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to look into our social media activities. On our coverage of France's colonial crimes, we had at Sultan Okez stating, France, Libya, Tunisia, and EU, the facts of criminal action from France in the past and now. On our coverage of COVID-19 in Africa, we had at Coronavirus Con 6 stating, the great news is that the persistence of low infections or deaths in Africa compared to the predictions that were so dramatic. We also had Encyclopedia stating, Madagascar claimed to have a cure for coronavirus, but they still have more 2,000 sick individuals. We can't just trust Madagascar because they are Africa. They should provide evidence like everyone else. No free pass here. At Discover Simper stated, the problem is that COVID is expensive. People cannot afford to have the coronavirus in Africa. That's all for now. Visit our social media platforms. I encourage you all to share your thoughts. Tag us in your posts, images, and videos, and we will share them right here for you. Thanks for staying tuned.
And that wraps up this week's edition of Africa Today,
a program which brings you refreshing and incisive analysis on Africa, the rising continent.
And until next time, goodbye from me, Mubarak Kenya.
And me, Shilene Lima, and the entire team. Goodbye.